All right, everyone. I hope we have everybody in. I see a few stragglers still joining, so maybe we'll give it one more minute here. But we do want to get started, and for the sake of time and being conscious of everyone's time today. So we'll get started with the introduction as we've got a few more rolling in. But I want to again thank everyone for coming on behalf of Leger. For those of you who have been a part of this journey with us since 2018 when we presented our first iteration of the youth study, here we are in 2022 ready to present the fifth, and I'm very excited this year to be joined by my Alberta colleague, Alanna Meyer. I'll get Alanna to introduce herself and then I'll do my introduction and we'll get started. Alanna.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Alanna Meyer. I am a research director here in the Alberta office. I'm based in Calgary, and I'm very excited to be with everyone today and to talk more about the future for young people.
Thank you, Alanna. And for those of you who have joined us before, you may remember myself. If not, my name is Allison Watson. I'm Associate Vice President out of our Edmonton office. Really excited to be back presenting this year. Excited to be with Alanna for this series of the three-part series. And I'm very excited again to be joined by Nikolas next week when we go over the next study, which Alanna will give the dates and times for later on in the presentation. So we will get started. As I mentioned, this is our fifth year of conducting this research, and we have gained a little bit more insight into youth and specifically how youth are feeling post-pandemic. So there's 5 key outlooks that we've pulled from this year's study that we're going to be focusing on in this presentation, and you're going to get pieces of it throughout next week's presentation as well. You're going to be able to recall some bits of information if you listened to Allan and Nikolas's presentation last week. So in today's, we're touching on 5 points regarding youth outlook heading into 2023. So the first bullet point there is the pandemic effect. I remember presenting in 2021 and even starting in 2022 about what the impacts of the pandemic was going to be, what the impacts and what the trends were going to be like of some of the changes we were seeing among youths, their perceptions, their behaviors, their mental health. A lot of new things came to light and different directions that perhaps people weren't quite expecting or feeling to be as prevalent as they were. And this year, we've finally got a couple years of data under our belt to really give some more insight into that, sorry. And we're really starting now to see the impact of the pandemic. And we've got some good points later on in this presentation that will kind of add to that, the pandemic effect. We've also have the future crisis. So youth today are concerned. They've been concerned since the onset of this study, quite frankly. But they're continuing to be concerned. What are they concerned about? How concerned are they? We're going to get into that in a little bit. The personal crises. Allan is going to take over at this point, but we're still seeing the mental health struggles. This year, we're seeing a desire for slower pace of life, but they're happy. Seems a little bit confusing maybe, but Alanna will take it from there when she gets to that point and really help us all understand how those 3 things can all be happening at once. There's a distrust in institutions. We touched on this last year. We're still seeing it this year. We're seeing the lack of confidence that youth have in these major pillars and institutions of our society. And again, Alanna is going to take us on a little bit more of that journey later on in the conversation. And finally, how can you be the change? Whether you're a large corporation, whether you're an employer, whether you're a young parent as a millennial, or perhaps you're parents of a millennial, how can you be the change? We have some thoughts. We're going to dive into it, and we'll touch on that at the very end. So the methodology hasn't changed for those of you who have been around with us for a while now, for the past 5 years. Very, very high level. We have the numbers up on the screen for all of you. We talked over to just over 3,000 millennials and members of the Gen Z generations. Just over 2,000 were millennials, and just over 1,000 were members of Gen Z. We have some breakdowns of some further demographics there if anybody wants to take a look. What's interesting to note here is we are seeing fairly equal distributions among education. We're seeing over 1/3 that are now homeowners compared to equal portions who are tenants and living at home. And we're seeing the consistent proportion of visible minorities within our sample as well. So just some context and some background and some great bits of information that we'll pull out throughout the conversation and some of our findings. So I mentioned the pandemic effect as our number one. So we'll start there at number one. Since 2018, we have seen an increase in skepticism among millennials and Gen Zers year over year. A lot has happened in a very short period of time for this generation. We came out of a recession as young adults. Myself, I'm a 1987 millennial, coming in as a young adult into university, seeing the effects that that economic state was having, not so much on myself, but more so on my parents. So seeing how that was from that perspective, then we come into the explosion of social media. Social media has erupted. We are now the generation that has really been there since the onset and seen how it evolves, and it now embeds every single aspect of our life. It impacts how we engage with family and friends. It impacts how we engage with brands and as consumers, and it also is our main source of, or one of our main sources now of information and connection to information. So that's something that no generation has had to see or evolve with or contend with prior to millennials and Gen Zs. We also have the introduction of that with influencers and viral sensations. Probably some of the Gen Xers and Boomers on the call, or even older, may have some sort of idea of what an influencer or viral sensation is, or perhaps can remember the first time they heard what they were and kind of thought, what was that? These are major influences in millennial and Gen Zers life, and major sources of information. And again, something that generations before have not had to engage with or respond to. We went through a global pandemic. We're still going through the repercussions of a global pandemic. We're seeing a war overseas, and now we're on our way into another recession. So we started off seeing some of the impacts of a recession, if we think back to some of the major key points of our generation, and now here we are going into 2023 complaining about the prices of lettuce as adults ourselves. So those are just a few key highlights of the true journey that millennials and Gen Zers have been on, and some context into perhaps why the skepticism is there, and further to this next point, why there's increasing worry, not only for ourselves as a generation in our future, but that of our community. And we touch on a lot of that throughout this presentation as well. So Alanna will get into this a little bit more, but this is the generation, and it's important to note the connection to the community there and the worry for the community, because they're connected to everything around them and they want to be the change. They don't trust those who can make the change. So the best way that they can start making the change, and I'm actually going to let Alana finish that one later on, and she'll carry on that thought, but just keep that in the back of your mind through the presentation as well. So what does all this skepticism and worry mean? It means they want to live in the moment because they really have no clue what the future has in store for themselves or the future in general. It means that they are conservative spenders. And if you caught our presentation last week, Allan and Nikolas noted that youth today that are saving or investing their money are doing so to prepare for the future and financial security. They're less inclined to indicate that they're saving for that big purchase, the new home, or to go traveling. They're really just saving because they want to be secure for their future. So they're thinking differently perhaps in what they want to use their money for. So the second point that we touched on was the future crisis. So they really are the generation stuck kind of between being a realist and a pessimist. And some of the points that we have for that are going to come up right now for you all. So I touched on the generational societal influences that this generation has faced since becoming a young adult. And for the Gen Zers, this is something that things that they have faced since they were quite younger than the millennials, the older millennials. So it may surprise you, or sorry, it may not surprise you to see that 58% do not believe that their personal finances will improve in 2023. It's interesting to note here, though, and I want to make sure this is noted, that 36% of that 58% feel that their personal finances will remain the same, while 21% feel that it's going to deteriorate. So we're seeing at least more stability perception than a decline when it comes to personal finances. We see pessimistic perceptions increasing with age when it comes to their personal finances. So as the cohorts are getting older, there's a more pessimism that, you know, their income is going to deteriorate. Perhaps this could be a result of having experiences with more life stages that require more attentions to finances. As we've noticed in previous presentations, and we mentioned this last year, they still view themselves as the downgraded generation. So they perceive themselves to be the sacrifice generation. We're still seeing that. 60% want to live in the moment because they don't know what tomorrow will bring. 50% believe that they belong to a disadvantaged generation as a whole. 57% feel powerless to deal with society's problems, and 42% believe they are among the last generation that can live comfortably, with all this extra that's going on behind them and what they're seeing, not only for themselves, but for their community. So leads us into the crisis of the collective future. Now, what about the crisis of the collective future? 74% of youth do not believe that the economic situation will improve. Interesting to note here, if you watched our studies last year, that this is up from 66% in 2021. When we break it down, 27% feel that it's going to remain the same, and 47% feel it's going to deteriorate. So while they're more inclined to feel that their personal economic situation, their finances are going to stay the same, when it comes to economic situation as a whole, that changes. It's no longer that. They're more inclined to feel that it's going to deteriorate. But I don't think many of us can argue with that in knowing what we're heading into over this next 6 months to a year. 73% of youth do not believe that the political situation will improve. This is actually pretty consistent with 2021 results, albeit it's still high and something that we want to point out. We haven't noticed a big jump or either direction. And it's still supported, and Alana is going to touch on this in a little bit, by the lack of confidence that we see youth having in government and political parties. 78% of youth do not believe that the environmental situation will improve. Again, we see a greater proportion feeling that it's going to deteriorate rather than remain the same. This is something we've consistently found with this generation. They are very, very environmentally conscious. They are very concerned about where the state of the environment and climate change is going. One thought, as to recently with some of the recent changes to single-use plastics and bylaws that are happening federally as well as at municipal levels, this is the first generation that's now being forced to change their consumption habits. Something that went from, we're reverting back to the ways of, paper bags, or using less plastic, or reusing and using glass products. These are the ways perhaps of our grandparents' generation or the generations before. Our generations of our parents, the ones before, were able to hone in on the efficiencies of single-use plastics and how that makes consumption easier, or that makes, shopping easier. Now with millennials and Gen Zs are at their prime consumer state of their lives, where they probably have more financial stability. They're able to make more of these purchases. They are making these purchases for themselves, not their parents doing it for them, and they're having to revert their habits, and what they've grown up as the only thing that they've known is now not allowed and having to change. So there's some recent evolution in that this generation is now having to work through, which also is making them part of the change, but also makes it a little bit of a kind of sticking point when they feel disadvantaged compared to other youths, or dealing with the repercussions of generations before them. So we have a few, so all in all there's a loss of confidence in the future of their community. We also have some recent trends. Now, quiet quitting and great resignation are trends that we're seeing. We're not going to get into that until next week's webinar, so be sure to register now for that if you want to hear more about those. I'll touch on a couple of these. So eco-anxiety is going to come on the next slide. We'll touch on some of those trends that we're seeing. And then distrust of institutions, and Allan is going to note that. Another thing that we noted in this year's study is we asked millennials and Gen Zs, if they want to have children. From that question, we got varied responses, whether they don't want more than they already have, if they want more. But what we found interesting is that 22% do not want children at all. This is higher among Gen Z, which may be expected. They're younger, they're not thinking that far ahead. Perhaps, given their thoughts of how the future is looking and how their future is looking, it makes them really concerned about having children and if they can do that. And we see that in the responses that they gave to us as to why they don't want to have children. So 52% indicated that they never wanted children. 44% indicated that they're not comfortable bringing children into the world in a climate crisis, and 42% are afraid they won't have the financial means to be parents. So just some interesting trends that we found aside from the crisis, the personal crisis and the crisis of the collective future. So going over the eco-anxiety and in climate change, this is something we've seen with this generation year after year. 54% say that they are stressed about the consequences of climate change, and 67% say that upheavals will happen soon. So war, population movement, natural disasters. I think in that opening bit that I gave about what this generation has seen over a short period of time, it really adds to this and supports why they may feel that way. I don't think any of that is quite surprising to anyone. We see here the intergenerational frustrations that they're having. 58% believe that the governments are not doing anything and are betraying the younger generations. 48% say that the generations that preceded them are responsible for climate change. Maybe a little bit context that I just gave may allude to that, could be part of that. Again, now we're having to change some of our habits and try to think of ways to make things better, where perhaps that wasn't quite the focus of generations before. And then there's eco-friendly actions. So we asked a few of these, and these are some of the ones that we found interesting. 43% have indicated that they have limited their air travel. 36% have indicated that they make important life decisions based on environmental considerations, specifically where they live, how many people they live with, and 31% plan their transportation habits in terms of their environmental impact. So deciding perhaps if they're going to bike or walk or use transit or however their habits may change. And I think we're seeing some changes in how youth and how this generation does move around. And I think many of us can maybe think to some of our day-to-day or what you see in your communities that may support that. So at this point, I will pass it over to Alanna. I will still drive. So Alanna, please let me know if I'm not clicking when you need me to click. But I will pass this on to Alanna to take us into the personal crises.
Great, thanks, Allison. So next we're going to look at how we are doing when it comes to well-being and mental health and what this personal crisis looks like. So going on to the next slide here, what we're seeing is that there might be another pandemic hitting your company. So we're seeing that 70% say they have experienced moments of depression or anxiety. So this comes in the form of a quarter saying they've had a major depression, and then about 2 in 5 saying they've had moments of depression or periods of anxiety. And this is higher among women when it comes to men. So these numbers might seem quite staggering. It's important to remember that this is anyone who's ever experienced any of these, not that they're currently experiencing these. However, it's not overly surprising given the past few years we've had. The pandemic changed how many of us experience what would have been very new and exciting experiences and milestones in our lives. So we were isolated and moving online in a time where friends and social networks are really of top importance in our lives as young people. So thinking about all the fun and new experiences in high school and university, even to starting a new job and career online. So maybe that excitement of going into the office for the first time, having your first job downtown, making new friends, it didn't really happen the way it normally does. And a lot of us felt disengaged. We missed out on a lot of good times and it was really hard on us. Another factor to consider when looking at these figures is that it is more socially acceptable among our generations to talk about mental health compared to older generations when it was often a topic that was taboo or maybe we avoided talking about. So this means that as younger people, we're likely more open to saying that we have experienced challenges with our mental health. So thinking about what this means for your organization, It really means that being more human and putting well-being first is something to consider as an initiative, a strategy, or as part of your narrative, if it does make sense for your brand. We are a generation who can relate to these things. We're more in touch with our mental health, and having brands that also consider this is really important. So there's ways that brands have been doing this. It doesn't always have to be on a large scale. It can just be, small moments or interactions that we have. So some examples are how smartphones and apps can help limit screen time. There's often an option to take a break with an app rather than deleting it. And then most recently, iPhones, instead of just their regular do not disturb function, they now have a time for personal time. So it's just these small things that that brands can do to help prioritize mental well-being. So going to the next slide here. With all that said, there are definitely some generational paradoxes that we're seeing. So the first one is that most of us, so 2/3, we're saying that we're generally happy in life, even though we have experienced moments of depression and anxiety. So how can this be possible? It could speak to that not all periods of anxiety and depression are long lasting. It could speak to that we're also a resilient generation where we can adapt, we're used to change. And despite all the challenges we might have experienced, we can still move forward and find ways to be happy. An important finding here is that men are actually significantly less happy when we compare it to women. However, they were less likely to say that they've been depressed or anxious. So definitely a bit of a contradiction there. So it could mean that men are unhappy for other reasons. It could mean that they're less able to identify anxiety or depression, or maybe that they're less likely to speak up about it. So some things to keep in mind when engaging with men. Another interesting difference we found here is that feeling generally happy in life drops in our 20s, and then it comes back up in our 30s. I think we can all understand why this might be. There's a lot of figuring out in our 20s, a lot of uncertainty, what we're going to do with our lives, what kind of education we should get, what career we should start, what relationship we should be in. It can be pretty daunting and pretty stressful. So once we hit our 30s, we hopefully have things a little bit more figured out, starting a career. Our lives are a bit more stable. We've maybe built a little bit of wealth, so likely contributing to that increase in happiness. And something important to consider when creating products and services and experiences for each generation, we can often be in different headspaces and looking for different things depending on our stage in life. A couple other interesting findings we're seeing here is that that movement towards wanting to live in the present moment and wanting a slower pace in life, which actually 2/3 of Gen Z and Millennials said that they're looking for a slower pace in life. So I'm sure we can all relate to how busy life gets. There's a lot going on. Sometimes you feel like you just need a break. These feelings among young people, they're definitely manifesting in different ways, especially in the trends that we're seeing, or even in micro trends. So things like self-care, which we know has been around for a long time, from self-care Sundays to having a multi-step skincare routine is just one way to kind of slow down and take care of yourself and be in the moment. There's also digital detoxing, so taking a break from screen time and devices and being constantly connected. And most recently, we're seeing a trend that is around romanticizing your life. So I challenge everyone to go to TikTok and look this up. So it's kind of a way of mindfulness. It's really about enjoying life's simple pleasures rather than just looking forward to that one vacation that we have planned. So it could be something like having fresh flowers at the table while you sip your coffee, or taking the time to make a really nice lunch for yourself. It's really about just making the most mundane things in your day feel unique and special, because it's really what makes up the majority of our lives. So definitely a lot of trends towards slowing down, being in the moment, and finding ways to make each day special and make ourselves a bit more happy. So we're gonna look next at this theme around distrust of institutions and what that is looking like among our generations. So first, just looking at what Gen Z and Millennials are saying about institutions. So we're saying there's too much red tape, they're inefficient, they're outdated, they represent older generations, and also that they might be responsible for today's problems and they're not bringing about change. So overall, it feels like the way institutions are working right now, it's not really resonating with us, not exactly fitting what we're looking for, and not what we feel like is needed in today's society. So looking a bit closer at this distrust, so we asked, in general, do you have confidence in the following institutions? So we asked about police, banks, the justice system, public and government agencies, all the way through to political parties, as you can see there. And overall, what we're seeing is there is a lack of confidence in institutions. So for the majority of these, it's less than half who have confidence. So that tells us there is a majority who doesn't have confidence. It's particularly low for political parties, for large private companies, for web giants and mainstream media. So institutions that are a part of our daily lives that impact us, but also they're oftentimes our employers. So an important consideration for employers is that a large portion of us don't have confidence in these types of institutions. When we look at our two generations here, we're seeing Gen Z tends to have higher confidence versus millennials, likely because over time we have more touch points with institutions, we have more experiences, we see what's happening in the world and in the news, and it is bringing our confidence down based on what we're seeing. So we are generations that are very connected. We have a lot of information at our fingertips. We often know what corporate scandals are going on. They go viral instantly. There's also documentaries that go viral that expose what's happening. For example, Dirty Money, if anyone's seen that documentary on corporate greed. So there's just a lot of information out there for us. Even what we see what's happening with Balenciaga right now and their campaigns and children in them. You can't open up your phone without seeing that. Or even the sexual harassment scandals with the military or Hockey Canada. We are in tune to what's happening, and we have a lot of information compared to maybe 30 or 40 years ago where there wasn't that easy access and maybe there were just a few sources. So thinking about what this means for institutions and for organizations, there's really a need to build back confidence, to modernize, and show that there's going to be action taken on what's important to young people. So maybe if there's been some wrong done in the past, institutions need to admit to what they've done, communicate how they're changing it, and act on it. And our generations are really holding institutions accountable. We also value transparency. So whether it's in how institutions operate, how they're treating people, also how they're treating data, and privacy is becoming more and more important since we have so many digital touch points with them. So really now is the time to consider, what do young people value? We're looking for institutions who are more than just about profit and their own agendas, and those who can do more good in the world. So be more sustainable, be more inclusive, and overall just be more human and be more than just a part of the bottom line. So Lastly, we're going to talk about how to be the change and what your role can be in that in engaging young people. So first, we're looking at how the key theme is really change through proximity. So we asked here, which organization do you think is most effective in improving society? And overwhelmingly, we're seeing that it's local communities. So activist groups, neighborhood communities, just groups on a more local level. We're also seeing governments, so provincial and federal, being viewed as effective in positively improving society. This is likely because they have jurisdiction on things that we care about. So education and healthcare and rising costs of living, they do have the power to influence those and change them. And to a lesser extent, we are seeing cities and municipalities, businesses, and also major international institutions, but much lower there, likely related to the lack of confidence in these bigger organizations, and that it isn't really viewed that their motive or goal is positive change rather than maybe their own agenda. So going to the next slide, what this means for organizations is that there's really an opportunity to engage more on a local level, a community level, and making that engagement more intimate, even if you are maybe a national or multinational organization. It's really around this hyperlocalism. So finding ways to make positive changes within communities. So whether it's within a certain city or region or a group based on more a common interest or a common goal. Canada is a big place, and people are now starting to identify more locally and with smaller communities. They can be in person, they can be digital, from advocacy groups to community organization, partnerships with arts and culture organizations, economic development, even local businesses or makers. We're seeing a lot more of those as well. So a lot of ways this can take form. We're already seeing this in a lot of different trends, which are taking place, but are also still opportunities. So things like farm to table and having more that local sourcing and maybe reducing transportation costs and bringing, fostering a more local economy. Also micro-influencers, so working with an influencer who maybe has a more regional or niche market around probably 10,000 followers versus those influencers with 500,000 or 1 million followers. Also, we're seeing this in local markets, so a lot more creators and makers and those kind of local markets and economy flourishing around cities. Another way this can come is through user-generated content. So rather than businesses or companies making their content, they invite consumers or their advocates, their fans, to create their own content and engage that way, not just with the brand, but with other people in the community. And also collaboration. So I'm sure we've all seen how many collaborations are out there now. They can happen between a big brand, a small brand, even brands from two different categories that can bring communities together. So lots of different opportunities, but overall, what's super important to keep in mind here is that these types of engagements need to be very genuine, and it does need to make sense for your brand in order to be viewed as authentic. I think we are very discerning generations. We can tell when a brand is just doing something for the sake of it. So it does really need to be viewed as genuine. So thinking back to what Allison showed us, we know there's a feeling of pessimism about the future and how some are feeling powerless to tackle society's problems and that level of discouragement. So what we need are opportunities to do something on maybe a smaller scale, but that still makes an impact. So what's really important is to find ways to create spaces and opportunities for young people to engage and to be a part of the change that they want to see in the world. So being a part of that conversation, a part of that progress, even if it's just one step at a time, it's really helping make the difference that they want to see. So that wraps up what we had to share with you today. We're going to open up the floor for questions in a couple of moments, but just a couple of things to mention before we do that. We will have the youth study report available. It'll be the full report for all of the different presentations in this series. So we'll have it on our website, and then also you'll be receiving a copy by email after the last webinar, which is next week. So that takes me to our next slide here. So we have insights about Gen Z and Millennials employment in 2023. So definitely a hot topic. We know there's labor shortages happening, so we invite you to join that as well. And just wanted to thank everyone so much for taking the time to join us today. And we'd love to hear any questions.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So you can access the question and answer feature just in your icon menu, either at the top or the bottom of your screen. We have a few questions and comments in the chat, so thank you for those who have already contributed. One participant or one attendee has asked, what does the sacrificed generation mean? We don't provide the youth a definition of what we mean, what sacrifice means, but I think in hearing and seeing how youth feel about everything going on around them, their distrust in the institutions, their worry about climate change, that they really feel that they're now the generation that is dealing with the repercussions of those before them, specifically in regards to some of the upheavals that are currently happening, as well as the climate change concerns that they're really seeing that are very top of mind and key fixture in youth today's perceptions and lives. We also see it in how they, as Alanna was mentioning, in their distrust with governments and questioning more, that they perhaps feel at more of a disadvantage than the generations before, that in turn make them feel that they're rather sacrificed than being provided equal opportunities or you know, opportunities for future growth as generations before. We have a question asking if there's a major difference between younger generations and ambitions and Gen X or boomers. This is a good question, and we do hear it kind of every study or in some form at every study. We don't specifically ask in this year's study where they want to go in the future. It's more about how they're feeling right now. We really focused on the finance factor, you know, how is saving going, how are your major purchases going. We talk about, you know, being an employee this year. This is definitely an avenue that would be really interesting to explore in future studies. And I think it would also be kind of fun to maybe open some conversations with those before to see if they can recall how perhaps they felt at that time, and see if there's any differences. But unfortunately, we don't have any concrete to share with you at this moment. But I don't know if I would say that youth are more or less ambitious than those before. I just think that they are more in tune with the opportunities that are around them, and they're less focused on the traditional linear path of generations before, of finishing school, going to university, getting a job, having a family, retiring with a 30-year pension or whatever it may be. And they're really open to finding what works for them, what they want, exploring different avenues, and they're not afraid to pivot and change and go back to school or try a different career path. These generations.
And just to add to that, I think it's important for us to think about, I was just going to add, I think it's important to think about what we value as young people when it comes to our ambitions. So there is a lot more value on well-being, on work-life balance, and being able to enjoy our lives. So I think there's more of an attitude of maybe putting our happiness first a lot of the times than sticking out a career for 30 years. So I think that's why we're seeing things like quiet quitting, where some may view a job as a job and they don't want it to take over their lives. So I think that it really comes back to thinking about what young people value and how that impacts our ambitions.
Definitely. Alanna, maybe you can take this one too. These generations have a lot of information, but it seems to be mostly bad news and viral reports of scandals on social media. What do they know about the basics of the purpose of institutions and how they work or are supposed to work? You have any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't specifically ask about this in this survey, but it would be a great area to explore to understand, do young people really understand how institutions work and what they need to do? Because we know there is a lot of criticism, but also institutions do play a really important role. And I can't imagine it's easy for all of them. So there's likely an opportunity to educate young people about the purpose of institutions and how they're working. But I think there's also an opportunity for it to go the other way and for institutions to engage with us and ask us what we want to see.
Thank you, Alanna. And finally, our last question, if we don't have any further, any big regional differences in the data? And great question. We were actually just kind of poking around with this, but I know, Alanna, you had some thoughts.
Yes, so from the sections that I went over, it was in the confidence in institutions, particularly when it came to governments, public organizations, and political parties. We're seeing that there is less confidence in Alberta compared to the other provinces.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we kind of see that consistently throughout. There weren't any real big major noteworthy changes or differences in perception. If we look at Quebec versus rest of Canada, we're more inclined to see some more passionate and stronger opinions in Quebec than rest of Canada in some situations. If we're looking at rest of Canada specifically, we see kind of the stronger perceptions varying and happening between Alberta or Ontario generally when we ask about their perceptions and opinions. But if you had any specific questions or follow-up or wanting to know what a regional difference was or for a province that you're in, please feel free to email us at the email on the screen and we'd be happy to dig up a little bit of extra info for you. All right, I think that concludes all the questions. So I want to thank everyone on behalf of Alanna, myself, and the entire youth team here at Leger. Thank you for tuning in to our second of 3 webinars on this year's youth study results. We hope that you will register for next week's webinar. We'll be joined by Nikolas Lopez out of our Toronto office, and we'll be going over employment and what it looks like to be, or what youth employees want, need, and how that landscape is looking. So again, on behalf of Leger, thank you everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Hey, thanks everyone.